We were left to die. America's betrayal at the Bay of Pigs. Intro. History is not a quiet collection of dates and events. It is a story written in sacrifice and blood. A story of promises made, and promises broken. It is the story of men who were asked to be heroes, only to be abandoned at their moment of truth. This is one of those stories. It is the story of an invasion, a betrayal, and a disaster that would not only define a generation of Cuban exiles but push the entire world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. This is the story of the Bay of Pigs. Welcome to our channel. If you believe these stories are crucial for understanding our present, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Hook. They were promised air cover. They were promised a grateful nation would rise up and greet them as liberators. They were promised the full backing of the most powerful country on earth. But on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs, all they found was the thunder of enemy fire and the crushing silence of the allies who had left them to die. How did it all go so terribly wrong? How did a secret plan to free a nation become one of modern history's most infamous fiascos? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to a revolution that changed everything. Section 1. The Promise. In 1959, the political landscape of the Americas was shaken to its core. A charismatic guerrilla leader, Fidel Castro, descended from the Sierra Maestra Mountains and marched into Havana, toppling the American-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. For many Cubans, it was a moment of euphoric hope. For the United States, it was the start of a nightmare. The Cold War was at its peak, and a revolution just 90 miles from Florida was an unacceptable move on the global chessboard. As Castro began nationalizing American industries and forging ties with the Soviet Union, panic set in. The fear in Washington was real: a communist satellite, a Soviet foothold in America's backyard. By March 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had seen enough. He authorized the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to draft a plan. The objective: overthrow Fidel Castro, by any means necessary. The CIA, led by spymaster Allen Dulles, had a playbook for this. They'd already orchestrated successful coups in Iran and Guatemala. Their plan for Cuba, codenamed Operation Pluto, was audacious and brutally simple. They would recruit Cuban exiles, train them into a guerrilla army, and send them back to liberate their homeland. The CIA was convinced that the moment these freedom fighters hit the beaches, the Cuban people would rise up in a massive, spontaneous rebellion. The invasion force would be the spark, the Cuban populace, the wildfire. The agency set up shop in Miami, recruiting from the growing community of exiles. These were not mercenaries. They were doctors, lawyers, students, and farmers who had lost everything. Many were young, some barely out of their teens, all united by a burning desire to reclaim their home. One recruit, Albert Belay, was just a teenager when his parents sent him to Miami. When his brother joined the fight, Albert went with him, telling himself it was to protect his younger sibling, but also admitting, "I love my country, I didn't like Fidel Castro, I had many other reasons to do it." These men, known as Brigade 2506, were flown to secret training camps in the jungles of Guatemala and Nicaragua. For months, they were forged into a fighting force. They learned amphibious landings, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. They were given weapons, uniforms, and something far more powerful: a promise. Their CIA handlers swore they would not be alone. They were promised American planes would control the skies. They were promised American ships would guard their approach. And they were promised that their actions would trigger a popular uprising that would welcome them as heroes. They were told they were the vanguard of a new, free Cuba, backed by the full, hidden might of the United States. And they believed it. To them, failure wasn't an option. They had no idea failure was already being written into the plan. Section 2. The betrayal. In November 1960, a new president was elected. John F. Kennedy, young and charismatic, inherited Operation Pluto from Eisenhower. Kennedy was a fierce Cold Warrior, but the sheer risk of the CIA's plan gave him pause. A full-blown war with Cuba was the last thing his new administration wanted. The CIA, however, was persistent. Allen Dulles and the operations architect, Richard Bissell, assured the new president the plan was solid. Most importantly, they swore America's involvement could be kept secret. This concept of plausible deniability became the operation's central, and fatal, pillar. Under pressure to look tough on communism but terrified of open conflict, Kennedy made a critical change. The original landing site, Trinidad, was near mountains, an ideal escape route for the invaders to wage a guerrilla war if things went south. But Trinidad was also populated. A battle there would be too loud, too visible. So, at Kennedy's insistence, the CIA changed the landing site to a remote, swampy area on the southern coast, the Bay of Pigs. Militarily, it was a catastrophic decision. The bay, known to Cubans as Playa Girón, was surrounded by impassable swamps with only a few roads leading out. It was a kill box. There was no large population nearby to rise up and join them. The CIA's own planners warned it was a disaster waiting to happen, but their warnings were ignored. Politics overrode military common sense. The operation kicked off on April 15, 1961, with an airstrike. A squadron of American B-26 bombers, crudely painted with Cuban Air Force markings, took off to destroy Castro's small air force on the ground. But the strike was only partially successful. Worse, the flimsy cover story immediately fell apart. When one of the B-26s landed in Miami claiming the pilot was a defector, reporters noticed the plane was obviously American. The world now knew. The element of surprise was gone. An infuriated President Kennedy, watching his plausible deniability evaporate, made another fateful decision. He cancelled the second, crucial wave of airstrikes planned for the morning of the invasion. That second strike was meant to finish off the rest of Castro's planes. But with the UN in an uproar, Kennedy flinched. That decision, made in the quiet of the White House, was a death sentence for the men of Brigade 2506. At that moment, they were sailing toward their homeland, with no idea that the sky, their promised shield, would soon become their greatest enemy. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 17, the invasion began. And it was a disaster from the first minute. Unseen coral reefs tore the hulls of the landing craft, sinking some before they even reached the shore. The local militia, which the CIA had dismissed, put up a surprisingly fierce resistance. And a radio station on the beach began broadcasting a frantic, minute-by-minute account of the invasion to the entire island. Fidel Castro, far from being caught off guard, reacted with stunning speed, taking personal command. And he still had an air force. The very planes Kennedy had spared now roared over the Bay of Pigs. They strafed the beaches, pinning the invaders down. They targeted the brigade's supply ships, the Houston and the Rio Escondido. Both ships were hit and sunk, taking the brigade's ammunition, communications gear, and hope to the bottom of the bay. On the beach, the men of Brigade 2506 fought with incredible courage. Outnumbered and outgunned, they held their ground, desperately searching the skies for the American jets they were promised. But the skies were empty, except for Castro's planes dealing death from above. Their frantic radio calls for help went unanswered. Roberto Pichardo, a member of the brigade, spent 3 days dodging strafing runs, waiting for American reinforcements he was sure would come. They wouldn't. The men of Brigade 2506 were utterly alone. The promise was broken. The betrayal was complete. Section 3, The Reckoning, For 3 agonizing days, the battle raged. The 1,400 men of Brigade 2506 fought a Cuban army that swelled to over 20,000 soldiers, backed by Soviet-supplied tanks. It was a heroic but hopeless stand. Pinned on the beach, with their supplies gone and ammunition running low, the end was inevitable. On the 3rd day, the survivors began to surrender. Over 100 brigade members were dead. More than 1,100 were captured. The prisoners were paraded through Havana as civilians screamed, "Paredon! Paredon! To the wall!" They were sentenced to 30 years in prison. For nearly 2 years, they languished in squalid conditions, becoming pawns in a new political game. Albert Belay and his brother spent 18 months in the infamous Castillo del Principe, eating pumpkin every single day for weeks on end. Finally, after painstaking negotiations, a deal was struck. The United States agreed to pay a ransom of $53 million in food and medicine for the prisoners' freedom. In December 1962, the surviving members of Brigade 2506 finally came home, not as liberators, but as survivors. For President Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs was a public humiliation. He took full responsibility, famously saying that victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. Privately, he was furious with the CIA. The fallout was swift. CIA Director Allen Dulles and his top deputies were forced to resign. But the biggest consequence was what it did for Fidel Castro. The invasion, designed to topple him, made him a national hero, a David who had stood up to the American Goliath. His position, once shaky, was now rock solid. He openly declared Cuba a socialist state and ran straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. This disaster set the stage for an even more terrifying showdown. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, seeing Kennedy as weak, decided to test him. A year later, spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, sparking the Cuban Missile Crisis, a standoff that brought the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been. The ashes of the Bay of Pigs had nearly set the world on fire. For the veterans of Brigade 2506, the scars never healed. Julio González Rebel, a B-26 pilot during the invasion, later said, "The brigade members have been betrayed twice, once in April 1961, and now in December 2014, referring to the later normalization of relations with Cuba. Their sacrifice became a defining moment for the Cuban-American community, fueling decades of fierce opposition to the Castro regime." Section 4. What if? But what if things had gone differently? If Kennedy had stuck with the original plan to land at Trinidad, the brigade would have had access to the nearby Escambray Mountains, a perfect escape route to wage the guerrilla campaign they were trained for. Instead of being trapped in a swampy killbox, they could have melted into the hills. And what if Kennedy had never cancelled that second, crucial airstrike? Had those B-26 bombers flown, they might have wiped out Castro's remaining air force. Without air cover, Castro's forces would have been vulnerable. The brigade's supply ships might have survived. The men on the beach wouldn't have been mercilessly strafed from above. With control of the skies, the battle for Playa Girón could have had a very different outcome. Conclusion and CTA: the story of the Bay of Pigs is more than a failed military operation. It's a cautionary tale about the arrogance of power, the danger of secret plots, and the real human cost of political miscalculation. It is the story of brave men who carried the hopes of a nation on their shoulders, only to be crushed by the weight of a promise that was never meant to be kept. They fought for freedom, but found only betrayal. Their sacrifice is a tragic reminder that in the grand game of geopolitics, the lives of heroes can be the first to be written off. What do you think was the single biggest mistake? Changing the landing site, or cancelling the airstrikes? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see how this disaster led directly to the world's most dangerous nuclear standoff, Subscribe and hit the notification bell for our next video on the Cuban Missile Crisis.